What is this betrayal that you speak of?
Okay. Well, luckily, the Canadians outnumber the non-Canadians now, so I can make some specific references.
Oh, no.
So this is apropos because both this episode is coming out a few days before Father's Day, if my calendar brain is correct. I think this is coming out on like the 13th, and Father's Day is on the 18th. And also, we are recording this after the incident that happened to me over the weekend. So last weekend was May 24, formerly known as Victoria Day, which is just a random weekend we get off once every May.
Okay.
Not usually on May 24th, but a 2-4 is a term in Canada for buying 24 cans of cheap beer. So, and it's usually the beginning of cottage season, so that's how it has its name.
Okay.
I have to do like a Canadian 101 primer for it.
This helps me out, so I understand what's happening. So this is good. Yeah. This is good. I'm on board. So this sounds good to me so far. What's the problem?
It's a holiday about drinking lots of stuff, being outside, and barbecuing. It's pretty great. The main problem is that I spent May 24 having a little barbecue with my parents, which was fun. We had a good time. Had some shish kebab, had some like tzatziki. It was like a Greek theme. Actually, that's on bar too. But then we kept talking about like various things. Like, as the night goes on, we're talking about all sorts of stuff. I learned 2 important facts about my father, who I think I've referenced several times on this podcast, is like my inspiration for like taking an interest in science and like science fiction and like sort of just being a sort of rationally cool, collected person in the world.
Yeah.
I learned 2 facts about him in his retirement, which began about a month and 2 ago. Okay. 1, he is not, in fact, a enjoyer of the podcast It's Probably Not Aliens.
What? But that's the one that we do.
Yes, he's not a listener, and I don't expect my parents to like watch my videos or listen to my podcast. That's not just it. But it's the other fact, which is that my dad is
a father. Oh,
he is a consumer of ancient aliens adjacent content.
No.
And we were talking at dinner, and he was just like, "Yeah, I was watching this YouTube video about King Pakal, and like it looked like he was like, no." And I had like I had like a top 10 anime betrayals moment, and I like did the entire King Pakal episode at him basically.
This is no good, Tristan. What are we gonna do about this? Hold on. So you tried to convince him otherwise. How did that go?
It was fine. He kind of defaulted to like, I don't actually believe it. It's just a fun thing to watch on YouTube. I think my dad is bored and watching way too much YouTube in his retirement is the thing. So that's that. But I knew that this needed to start the episode because it was a traumatic thing. And if my dad ever listens to this podcast, he will know the pain that he inflicted upon me.
Yes. And there are parallels here between tragedy and, your family, you're struggling with your own familial trials, you could say. And that feels like it could tie into what we're talking about today. Is that a way to segue into the episode, do you think?
It's good enough. Yes. The fatal flaw of this podcast is that we we're unable to get on track and focus on anything. So
see, this is our own fault though, because we have always said at the end of the show that this podcast is good for dads, but we never specified which dads. And so we should have called out your dad on purpose to see if he would be willing to give us a shot, This is not...
This morning I had the shower thought that I was like, oh, I need to get my dad as a guest on this podcast at some point. Just to be like, all right, if you're not going to listen to it, here's a way I can get you to absorb at least one episode. But I also think that we should introduce our wonderful guest who's here today.
Who's been sitting, listening to us talk about your dad for the last 5 minutes.
I would like to introduce a really dear friend of mine who we've been known each other for years. This is Dr. Aven McMaster.
Hello. Hello.
For various reasons, because she's very smart and knows a lot about this specific topic. And also because we've shouted out her podcast in the past.
Much appreciated.
And furthermore, because you're literally an expert in Greco-Roman, especially the Roman side of things.
Yeah.
And also because, as a classicist, I'm sure you will appreciate this. Very often, when you are a person who majors in the historic arts, the history, very often you get asked, you get the conflation between the history department and the classics department, and classicists, who are usually not the larger of those two departments, can get very defensive about their field when it comes to like, hey, why aren't you history? Why aren't you archaeology? And I always know that like classics is very much its own extremely weird but very specific discipline.
That is exactly perfect. Yes. It's very weird and very specific. And only classics in the entire university can look down on the history department and say, well, you guys are just Johnny-come-latelys after all. I mean, there wasn't even a history department when universities started.
I guess
you
classics
may
is
think you
just
study the past, but you're new.
It's like the continuation of what was called the classical education, right? You get because it's not just history. It's like literature, poetry, languages.
In fact, classics comes out originally of, to use a term that came up earlier before we started recording, philology. Really, classics started as the study of the text and study of the language. And you only studied the history and the myth insofar as it was useful for understanding the literature, because that was all that was really important. And so it's the study of the classics, right? The classical period. It is expanded, and now there are classical historians, but there weren't really truly classical historians till the 20th century. It's a strange field. But yeah, classics is the study, now people refer to it as the study of the ancient Mediterranean. So it's expanded beyond Greek and Roman stuff into Egypt and Mesopotamia and North Africa and other areas. I'm sort of an old school classicist in the sense that my field really is literature, and so literature and language. But because I used to teach at a university that didn't have a graduate degree and a program and only had 3 full-time faculty, I've taught everything. You do everything. You don't get to be a specialist. So, I've taught myth, I've taught language, I've taught literature, I've taught history.
Yeah.
It's all part and parcel of the same thing.
Yeah. That's cool. I do a podcast.
Oh, I do
that's
too.
what I do. Yeah. If we're comparing, personal achievements. So you do all that cool stuff, and then I sit in front of a microphone every week.
Well, to be fair, I don't do that anymore. I was a professor for years, but my department disappeared. So now I work in government, but I also have a podcast. So,
Oh, excellent.
That's the continuity.
I do think that we're very well positioned for this episode because we have 2 people, a person who's an expert in the classics and a person who's an expert in superheroes and superheroics. For the record, everybody, this is a podcast called It's Probably Not Aliens.
That's our show. You're listening
where we talk about
hello fathers, hello dads listening to the show.
Hi, Dad.
Hi, Tristan.
You know who you
dad.
But this is a podcast where we talk about ancient apocalypse. Well, we did talk about ancient apocalypse, but pseudo history, pseudo archaeology, UFOs, an increasingly long list of people who do history bad. Specifically focus on ancient aliens. I'm Tristan Johnson. I did some research today.
That's awesome. I'm proud of you for that. My name is Scott Nicewander. I'm here to just break out into song anytime anyone mentions a character from the Disney Hercules, which is probably going to be a lot because I do think we are talking about Hercules, who is the titular character of the movie Hercules. So,
well, be careful because I might break out into song too, but for the theme song of the 1970s Hercules cartoon, which is its own special thing.
Now, how many references to the Kevin Sorbo Hercules are we going to do? Hopefully
none.
0.
No.
I only referenced Xena, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Xena is the only part of that world
perfect.
exists.
Because if we reference the Kevin Sorbo, I would be disappointed. That's the only line I know.
We did
That's
it.
the only reference.
Interesting. Also, I just got to say on the Disney Hercules, like whoever was in the design room where it's like, we're going to talk about this kind of Greco-Roman, like classical myth that is like the archetypical superhero. And it's like a huge part of like this like Greek-Roman history. And then they were like, you know what the music theme should be? Motown. Let's just do an entirely Motown inspired.
Well, it's like, I think it's kind of clever because it's like gospel music in a way, and it's about gods. I think that's clever. I think that's so fun.
Oh, it slaps super hard.
Yeah.
And Danny DeVito devours the scenery in it. It's got a Michael Bolton song. Like it's got everything.
It's the best. 100%. Yeah.
And what I learned is I assumed that the story in the movie was extremely inaccurate, and it is. But what I was actually surprised by was how that it had a lot more of the story in it than I thought. Like I realized that all of those like quick flashbacks as he's becoming a hero in the rising action is actually like the majority of his actual story.
Yeah. One of the things about that movie that is amazing is they made these substantial changes to the overall story and like a complete rewrite of the moral background and the worldview of the Greco-Romans to turn it into this Christian tale of good and versus evil, like all these things that completely, you could say, betray the original story. But at the same time, they knew the myths inside out, those writers and those animators, and all the way through there's all these like tiny little Easter eggs and little references to the most minute details. So it's not like they did it out of ignorance. They changed, and I get why they did. It's a Disney movie. There's lots of stuff in Hercules that's not family friendly.
Yeah, we're gonna get into
like
that.
His way he acts with his family, for instance, not friendly. So,
not a family man, no.
Yeah.
Well, in some ways, he's an extremely family man and extremely not a fan. We'll get into it. So let me.
Yeah. Can I ask a big, broad question? So, because this podcast is about ancient aliens and pseudoarchaeology, why specifically are we talking about Hercules today?
Good question. Because I was surprised myself. I never thought that I would have to be doing the Hercules episode of It's Probably Not Aliens, but here we are. So here's basically the episode that we're kind of chewing our way through, and we've kind of talked about this in the last couple weeks of the show, is this idea that aliens and a lot of our like references to gods and myths of the ancient past are actually either aliens or alien human hybrids that have had superpowers. These are things like your chimeric monsters, your classical monsters of antiquity, but also people like Gilgamesh and all of the Eternals. And one of them that comes up that just as randomly was like, what about Hercules? Because they did this whole thing where they talked a lot about how Apollo is apparently like a big alien deal, and he shows up in all this myth, which is, I feel like, a little bit stretching of comparative mythology there. But there's they do talk a lot about how, of course, Zeus was an alien because he had lightning bolts, like laser bolts, and it's just like Thor who also had lightning bolts. It's like
just like aliens have lightning bolts.
Like
you know how aliens
well,
have
I mean,
lightning
Star
bolts.
Trek told us that Apollo and all of those are aliens. So I mean, that's canon, right?
Yeah,
like
they were writing from.
We're not going to argue against that, are we, Tristan? Yeah. I mean, like
no. The
fact.
Strange New Worlds trailer just dropped, and it includes a crossover with the cartoon show Lower Decks, which does mean that the koala, that God is a koala, is now the official canon of the Star Trek universe. So
it's so good.
Yeah, I can't wait for it. It looks really good. Anyways, I love Star Trek. It's stupid and silly, and the parts where things don't make sense, they just don't talk about it again. We don't talk about the sex salamanders. You don't talk about that the center of the galaxy is God, who wants Star Trek, wants spaceships. It's a lot of the Greeks. I think Abraham Lincoln's in an episode of a thing. I think Satan is in an episode of one somewhere.
Oh, that's cool.
And also that there is currently living a like 300 foot tall Spock somewhere in the universe. Anyways, my knowledge of Star Trek is extremely broad, but we're going to talk about Hercules today.
Right.
Or
I think
Heracles.
you mean Huncules.
Come
on.
You can make some sweet music. Anyways. Our story actually begins on the show Ancient Aliens. So yeah, here are some like direct quotes they said. It's like, perhaps the most famous demigod is the Greek hero Heracles, or also known as the Roman Hercules.
So far true.
Heracles was half man, half god, conceived in the union of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene.
Yeah.
Already.
Alcmene or Alcmena. Yeah, either.
Cool.
But mainstream scholars have dismissed these tales of demigods as fantasy. But what if Hercules was real and he was just a god-human hybrid?
Alien.
What if?
Genetics aside, that is basically what Ancient Aliens is trying to posit. And what I'm here to say
that's
is
their whole thing that they say. We've talked about this
what
before. But what if he was an alien hybrid? Think about that first. Let that sink in. Actually, don't let it sink in too much. We're going to move on to the next thing now.
Yeah. So then I was like, okay, well, first of all, I get to study Hercules. I guess that's going to be a fun episode. I think that'll be really fun. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, try to talk about how Hercules is not so much like a person who was real as it is a feeling in your heart. And it's hard to turn somebody into, like, say somebody was a literal person when almost every aspect of his life is like symbolic of various parts of ancient cultures and such. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about is, like, I'm not going to do like the hardcore, because you can't prove a negative, but also debunking whether or not Hercules was real feels beneath even us. And I'm pretty low on the totem pole on this one.
The real Hercules is the lessons we learned along the way.
Yes.
That's the story.
So I want to start with Heracles. Heracles. Dimitri. Everybody from Greece is named Dimitri.
Yes.
Like, Heracles, and his like last name is like, I don't know, Papadopoulos or something. I don't know. He's one of what are called the chthonic heroes, which I think has some, there's Hades, I think, references this, but I guess.
Chthonios just means underworld, basically. Mm-hmm. So the heroes, because they die, because they have mortal parts, are buried. So they're under the earth. So there's the heavenly, which is the Olympians and gods. And then there's the chthonic, and that's the heroes, but also Hades and a couple of other, and Persephone and a couple of other chthonic deities, which are under the ground. So.
Perfect.
Also, chthonic is just a fun word in Scrap.
It is.
Oh, that's a good. I got to keep that in the back pocket.
A lot of H's.
Mm-hmm. But unlike other Greek heroes, apparently no tomb has ever been described as being the tomb of Heracles. And apparently other heroes have their actual tombs as like physical locations somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Oh, cool.
He's both a hero and a god, or as Pindar says, Heros Theos.
Everything rhymes in Greek, so that's not special. Just okay. They all have the same endings.
The way this sticks out is basically because as a person, he gets certain types of like honorifics, but then they also do things like festival sacrifices. So apparently they do the same festival sacrifice as a hero with something called a chthonic libation. And then they do another one as a god upon an altar, which makes him the most iconic embodiment of what is called a demigod by the standards of understanding mythology, basically.
Yeah, so the big difference, like gods and heroes are two different classes of what we would call divinity or supernatural beings or something like that. Those aren't good ancient terms, but and the big difference is essentially how you worship them. Like from if we're talking religion here, not myth, we're talking religion, then heroes are worshipped normally at their tomb, but as you say, Heracles didn't have tombs. So either at their tomb or at a significant site, and usually and it's in a chthonic way, it's like a development of ancestor worship. You're worshiping a shade of the dead. So you pour a libation, wine, or usually blood. When you sacrifice an animal, you pour blood because that helps reanimate the spirit, essentially, and it can appear to you and give you advice or prophecies, or just it feeds them and make them happy, because basically what you're doing with heroes is you're propitiating them, because if they're angry, they can do bad stuff. And so it's more like warding off the bad stuff they'll do if you don't pay enough attention to them, or if you make them angry, more than asking them to do stuff for you. And there's heroes, and that's how they're worshipped. And then there's gods, and they are normally, except for the subset of Hades and Persephone, these chthonic gods. But most gods, you do all stuff on altars, you look upward when you're sacrificing, you burn things on the altar so the smoke goes up, so rather than pouring libations to the underworld, you're sending the smoke and the burning of the animal, that parts that you're giving to the gods goes up into the heavens. And so it's like a ritual difference. And Heracles is weird in that he straddles that difference. Like there's lots of hero cults, and we use the word cult here because I feel this is important for a show about ancient aliens. I feel it's important to explain what cult means in an ancient context.
Yeah. Yes,
because
please.
it's kind of changed in the modern world. Cults is just the same root word as like culture and cultivate. It means to pay attention to and make grow. And so a cult is a particular way that you worship a particular being. So that's
fandom.
it.
It's the fandom.
Yeah, but it's not it's not even the people, it's the actual worship. So like the cult of Hercules at a certain place is we sacrifice these animals at this time, in this way, we say these words, and we have this festival. Mm-hmm. That's the cult of Heracles at Argos. And the cult of Heracles at Tiryns, uses a different animal and does it on a different day and whatever. And it's not that as a person you're a member of that cult. The cult is the things that are the worship.
Yeah.
So it's sort of weird to use the same term. It's just become something else now. But so there's nothing culty in the modern sense about it.
Right.
It's not about crazy people doing crazy things. So.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry. And then, divinity, normally you're either divine or you're a hero. And Hercules or Heracles is the weird one who's both. And that leads to strange things like his spirit being in the underworld in the Odyssey so that Odysseus sees him, but also he's supposedly divine, so he's up in Olympus. So how could he be both? And there's a line in Homer that was probably introduced later that's that was only his mortal part that Odysseus saw in the underworld. Because of course the divine part is up in the sky.
He's got
why he has
Christianity
no tomb,
is cribbing some notes here.
Yeah. Well, and that's why he has no tomb, because he had an apotheosis where when he was burned at the end of his life, his whole body goes up and disappears and goes up into heaven, into Olympus. Mm-hmm. And normally that's, so there can't be a tomb because he's a god now, but he's also worshipped like a hero. So he's weird. As with everything with Heracles, he's more. He's just more. Than everybody else.
Yes.
Speaking of weird, let's hear a little bit about his very interesting childhood and birth. So, first of all, if you know anything about your basics of Greek mythology, did not make it into the Disney movie. Heracles' father, Zeus, known for being one of mythology's most preeminent horn dogs.
Just
man, woman, mountain, swan, bull. Possibly, depending upon how you read things, even a lion at one point. He was a very busy man, and
does not discriminate.
Yes, and his wife, his eternal wife / sister or cousin or something. Sister. His sister wife, Hera, famously, because this is Greek mythology, so their thought is women, they just be like that, always complaining about their husband just cheating on them with literally everything. Always was going around and trying to mess with all of his progeny made through all of these dalliances. One of the ones that he does is with a woman named Alcmene, where he gives birth, or she gives birth to this person, and but out of an act of, I don't know, this part where it gets a little wonky, but somehow he is captured away as a young bebe and taken to Hera, saying hey, look, this baby is going to die if it doesn't nurse right now. And she nurses him, and then he bites her breast, and she rips him off, squirts milk into the air, and creates the Milky Way of the stars.
That's fun.
Just in case you're curious how that happened.
Yeah.
And then, the milk made him have godlike powers. And he did so. And Hera, when finding out who he actually was, tried to kill him by sending 2 snakes to kill him, in which he strangled them to death as a baby, which is the sign that he was he's going to be huge.
He's going to be strong.
And of course he had a brother, right?
Yes.
So he was born, Zeus took on the likeness of Alcmene's husband who was away at war. And so he went in and slept with her and extended the night so that it went 9 nights, because he wanted so long. He loved her so much that he wanted to be with her for 9 nights. So he extended the length of the night and slept, because it takes a long time to conceive a baby that important.
Powerful.
Yep.
But then in the morning, he got up and left, and her husband coincidentally came home the same day and slept with her. And she was very confused. She's like, "You want more?" But came home and slept with her. So she gave birth to twins. And one twin was Zeus's son, and one twin was her husband's son. How are we going to tell which is which? Oh, maybe it's the one who just strangled 2 snakes in his crib. So that's sort of part of where that story comes from. So he always had this brother who was the Iphicles, who was just the nobody. We hardly hear about him after his birth, but
we hear more about his son, who is Hercules' nephew, who actually features in one of his trials. But,
he turns.
But so this is the big thing, and as part of the sort of cultural observation, this is why even though Hercules, when we get to Rome, a lot of festivals and stuff that have to do with Hercules are strictly no woms allowed affairs. Women are like banned from like most stuff that has to do with them, except that women did do some form of like tying a special sort of Herculean knot, especially around childbirth, because they're trying to like inflict the strength to choke out snakes, I guess, to their children.
There's also
No, please.
There's also a fun story about when Alcmene is giving birth. Hera is mad, as always, at the women that Zeus has assaulted, because that is Greek. And so she comes down, she sends the goddess of childbirth, who's under Hera's sort of control, sends her down to prevent Alcmene from actually giving birth. And there's some bits about like, this is why he ends up not being the one who inherits the kingdom and stuff. But leaving that aside, so what the goddess does is she comes down and she braids her hair and sits cross-legged and crosses her arms and crosses her fingers and knots all the clothing, because this is sort of the sympathetic magic does not open the womb, have childbirth. And so she sits on the threshold with all of these normally women, unbound, bind everything and make sure there's no knots and everything so that the birth will go well. She sits there and she prevents, and Alcmene labors for days and days, and she can't give birth to this child, and it's terrible. And so Zeus finally sends someone to go and stop this, and doesn't matter who, somebody else comes along and makes the goddess laugh, and she jumps up and like releases her fingers and her crosses and everything like that. And in that very moment, Alcmene is able to give birth, and Hera's really mad, so she turns the woman who did that into a weasel, and that's why there are weasels.
That was the first weasel?
I do like how...
Sorry, there's always and that's why there were at the end of the story.
There's a lot of origin stories here.
It's partly because we have them all from Ovid, and that was what Ovid does, was always metamorphoses. But anyway.
That's so fun.
So Heracles was basically raised by Alcmene and the most cuckolded man in history by the extremely Greek and honestly D&D worthy name Amphitryon, who acts as his foster father. They even refer to him as Amphitryon in the movie, in the Disney, the official Disney canon movie.
See, there's a lot of this already that is like they're making references to it. They're not obviously not one to one, but the snakes.
They know it's there.
Yeah, they know it's there.
Yeah, they did the snakes too. Even a slight reference to the breast milk thing, I think, with the mortality potion and stuff.
It was like sort of an inverse of it, where like, it was the drinking from the bottle that made him mortal.
To take away,
Yeah. Okay, so he grows up and becomes like a famous warrior, goes to war, does a lot of conquering, all that good Greek stuff. Greeks love conquering and warring and all that kind of stuff. At least a lot of them do. He then wages a very victorious war against the kingdom of Orchomenus in Boeotia. Boeotia. Okay, lots of vowels there.
Yeah, just ignore half of them. It's fine.
As a reward for destroying this kingdom, the king of Thebes gifts him his daughter, which is the thing you could do, named Megara, who's the daughter of the king Creon.
Now this is because we've gotten this wrong before, but this Thebes, this is the Big Olive. Correct?
This is actually the Thebes not the Egyptian Thebes.
All right.
Yeah. So the daughter of the king of Thebes, Creon, the king of Thebes, gives his daughter Megara to Heracles to basically be married, and they have some kids. Hera, because women, am I right, as far as the Greeks go, decides that she's really mad that he's happy and having a family life. So she drives Heracles insane, and in a fit of rage, he kills Megara and their kids. As of doing so, he is devastated. He's as one would be in such a situation.
Yeah.
So in order to get penance, he goes to a servant of Eurystheus, who then says, all right, you can be forgiven for this. You just have to do 12 big things, or 10 big things, but then later on, 2 of them end up not counting for various reasons. So go do 10, but actually 12 things. If you could do these 12 things, and they're all mostly just either big killing jobs or big cleaning jobs. Basically, if you could do all 12, then you can be forgiven for murdering your wife and children.
It basically is he's told either by the oracle of Delphi or somebody else that he has to atone, but atonement isn't really about atonement. It's about getting rid of the pollution that murder causes. And so he's told he has to be enslaved to or in the power of his cousin Eurystheus for either 1 year or 10 years. Depends on the story. And then Eurystheus is like, well, I've got the strongest person in the entire world and I hate him. So let me give him a whole bunch of probably deadly tasks to do.
Yeah. Some grunt work.
Specifically chosen for being impossible or deadly. And
or embarrassing.
Yeah. So he basically goes on a multi-year D&D campaign going and taking care of all of these things.
With so many side quests. So many side quests along the way. That's what later on, they're like, we don't know where to put all these other things he does. Oh, we'll just put it as a side quest on all of his labors. And it genuinely, it's hilarious.
That's fun.
So let's I'll go this is really quick. The first one is that he goes and kills something called the Nemean lion, which in some depictions is another progeny of Zeus and a lion. So he has to go basically kill a giant lion who's killing people.
Whose hide is impenetrable to any weapons, so he has to strangle it.
Yeah.
And use its own claws to skin it.
Yeah,
that's why he wears the lion skin.
He skins it, wears it, and so very often you will see in depictions of Heracles, he's wearing a lion's pelt and usually a club. I don't know where the club fits in, but that's sort of his iconic things.
See, they did that in the movie
club,
too.
Like his bow and arrow, which he uses in a couple of other ones. The club and the bow and arrow are either symbolic of or reminiscent of, depending which kind of approach to myth you use, a pre-civilized form of weaponry. That's basically what they are, right? They aren't the sword and the spear, which is what heroes, even by Homer's time, are using. They're like pre that. So Hercules is this sort of older figure who uses the most primitive of weapons, the bow and arrow and the club.
Fair enough.
And they put they had him in the movie where the sort of the pelt of a lion when they were painting.
It was a scar. It was a pelt
scar.
It looked like Scar. Yeah.
That was dark.
Again, must have been a very fun time to be working at the studios then. So then, so having killed the Nemean lion, he then gets sent off to do another one, which is to deal with the 9-headed Hydra of Lerna, which is a snake dragon thing that has basically its heads grow back if you cut one off. The main thing that is he basically then enlists his nephew to cauterize the wounds of the decapitations, which eventually kills it. Very important. We would like to call this foreshadowing in a dramatic term. Then the Hydra is extremely venomous. Its blood is extremely venomous. So in order to, he loots the body and decides to basically inoculate some of his arrows with some of this Hydra venom that kills you in a very Greek tragedy type fashion, where you get hit and you say, I have been slain, and you die. So he gets a bunch of, he has poisoned arrows. That is now just put that in your pocket.
Just remember that. For later.
He's got poison
very
arrows.
Poisonous.
Obviously, the Hydra thing was a big part of the movie too. I don't want to keep talking about the movie, but like
it's all right.
Big important scene.
That's half the fun. So then we go. His third one is to go and capture the elusive stag of Arcadia, which is apparently a stag with golden horns that belongs to Artemis Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. And basically, so she basically is like, hey, don't take my golden horned stag. And he's like, yeah, but I'm like really cool. And then she's like, yeah, you are pretty cool. You can go.
Yeah.
I mean, he's her brother, so
basically, I
mean, like that's so's everybody because Zeus got around, but
Zeus,
family ties.
Everyone's family related. Tree. Your brother cousin. Then he has to go and capture what's called the wild boar of Mount Erymanthus. Where on the way there he gets drunk with one of his besties who's a centaur, and there's a lot of centaurs there, and the centaurs are mad that he drank the centaur wine. So then he gets in a fight and kills a bunch of centaurs.
And also his host centaur, by mistake, because he picks up one of the poisoned arrows. This is not the thing you would keeping poisoned arrows in mind for, but I'll just, he picks up one of the poisoned arrows to marvel at how easily it killed his friends, enemies, and then drops it and it scratches his hoof and he dies. So it's one of the many times Hercules accidentally or not kills a host, which is like the worst thing you can do in the Greek world, is to break host-guest friendships.
That's no good.
Big bad.
Drank the wine, had the salt and bread. Yeah, not good.
And then killed him. I mean, accidentally, but still, he's responsible.
But still.
As we know, if I know anything about the Greek stories, is that whether or not it's your fault doesn't really seem to matter.
It's still your fault. It's your fault whether it's your fault or not.
Yeah. He then gets the most epic cleaning job of all of history, where he's told that in a single day he has to clean the cattle stables of King Augeas Avilas, of which he does by redirecting 2 rivers to flow through the stable and clean it out.
The stable is so very dirty because these are man-eating cattle, and so nobody has cleaned their stalls in decades because no one will go in because the cows eat people. Please do not discuss any problems with that, approach to zoology. But anyway,
don't worry, it's not the only man-eating herbivore we're going to run into today.
Yeah. Very gross.
Then he gets sent to the Stymphanian marshes, where he has to go and kill some birds. These are special birds because they're kind of robot birds. I'll get into that. They're birds that eat people, but they're made of bronze, and they have sharp metal feathers that they can shoot. And most importantly, poisonous poop. And they're in a swamp, and they're also Artemis's pets. So Heracles goes to deal with this, but then apparently he's just far too big for the marsh, and he starts sinking into it. And he's like, I can't get to them. It's too marshy. I'm going to sink.
Now, believe it or not, I do have a question about the poisonous poop.
Okay.
Do they weaponize that? Do they like fly over and start pooping and
danger
on people? Yeah, I don't know.
I don't remember if they actually talk about that. I think it is causing problems to the people of the region, is what we are told. I think it's sort of vaguely said like that. Presumably it makes it a little hard to grow crops and stuff, but I don't think the versions we have get into the details.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
There's no monster manual that they made back in the day to explain
Sadly, no.
That it does 3d6 poison damage to whoever touches it or whatever. But then he's then, after finding that he can't go to these birds to capture them or kill them or whatever, he then has some serious sad boy hours until Athena feels really bad for him. Athena also being the Greek goddess of wisdom, the patron goddess of Athens, and a big deal in the Greek pantheon. She gives Heracles a rattle called a crotala, which was made specially by Hephaestus, who's like the god of volcanoes and crafting and blacksmithing and stuff like that. And basically makes this special for them. There's sort of a crotala is sort of like a castanet, is like the closest like Western, or I guess it says Western, but the closest like modern day instrument that would be. And basically, he shakes it on a certain mountain overhanging the lake and scares the birds into the air, which he then uses his special poisonous arrows to kill the birds.
Oh, and that's why
even the Disney movie, he catches it in a cage.
Oh yeah, see, I don't.
It's like a second and a half of footage, I think.
Yeah. Oh, you might be right.
Of documentary footage, obviously.
Yeah. He then, his next quest is that a woman, he has to go to the island of Crete, where those Cretanist people, specifically the wife of the king, has become rather in love with this bull and has had a child with the bull named the Minotaur. But the mad bull needs to be dealt with. Minotaur already exists, so nothing you can do about that. But except put him in a big maze. But that's a different story. That's a different myth. That's not his one.
Different myth, different hero.
Yeah, it's all part of the GCU, you know. These stories all just run into each other. The lore is complicated. Anyways, he has to capture the bull, and I just like the whole part about just this bull keeps seducing my wife. Please come kill it.
Well, it's 1 Minotaur too late, my friend.
Yup. Anyways, he does that. That one doesn't seem to have a whole lot written about it, because I imagine that more spins off into its own story with the Minotaur and Labyrinth.
Yeah, and then he lets go of the bull on the mainland, and then Theseus has to go get it later, because Theseus has to do all the same things as Hercules, but not quite as well, because Athens likes him. And Hercules is Sparta's god, or hero. Yeah. And so Athens has to have a hero like him. So he has Theseus, but he only has 6 labors. So he's kind of meanie, frankly.
He does all of the labors in little bits, and so by the time you're done, you don't even know if he's even completed them.
Ship thereof, yes.
The next thing he has to go do is he has to go see King Diomedes of Bistones.
Sure.
And he has to capture his man-eating horses.
Yeah,
because the king has been feeding his horses human flesh. So he has to go capture horses that eat human flesh.
Look, someone gave these animals their first taste of human flesh, and it has been a nuisance ever since.
In Greek mythology, human flesh is extremely delicious. Once you pop, you really can't stop. It seems. even if you eat grass for a living, apparently. Then, and here we go. Here we get to one that'll really hit Scott well.
All right.
He then has to go steal a woman's girdle. Specifically, he has to go steal the belt of Hippolyte, who is the queen of the Amazons.
All right. Yes. A little Wonder Woman action going on.
Yep.
And but of course, women, am I right? Hera tries to mess things up again by spreading a rumor amongst the Amazons that Heracles is planning to capture the queen and kill her. And so the Amazons try to stop him from stealing their belt. Okay. In some versions, he kills a whole bunch of women, and in some versions, they decided not to have that be part of the story. So,
Oh, it's. I mean, most of the heroes fight the Amazons in one way or another because the Amazons, like centaurs, represent all that is wrong with the world because they are an inversion of the natural order of things. Like centaurs are half human, half wild. That's bad.
Yeah.
So all the heroes fight them.
Can't do that.
Amazons are obviously women who fight and act like men and aren't controlled by men. So they also represent what is wrong with the world. So every hero has to go and impose his civilizing force upon them, which usually means both sleeping with and killing them.
Yeah.
With Hippolyta, he goes and he has like an affair with her for a year and then takes her. And the girdle represents her sexual chastity. So
a half human, half horse is just as bad as a bunch of women. I'm just saying.
A bunch of women with bows and arrows.
Yeah.
Like, really, what more could you possibly fear in the world?
the horror.
Yeah, the horror. Messed up, man. Women living their best life alone on an island? That's horrible.
Cannot be allowed.
Can't have that.
Cannot stand.
Just see what Sappho has to say about this. Anyways, the tenth thing that Hercules is imposed against. And this one is, okay, this one gets really funky. First of all, he has to go to the worst place in the entire world by his estimation, which is Spain. He has to go to Spain for this one.
Okay.
In order to steal some cows, specifically the cows of Geryon, who is, I see goes between either a giant with 3 heads or a giant with 3 bodies.
Which is totally the best because it makes no sense at all.
Yeah.
Like, does it mean one head and 3 bodies? Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
How would you do that?
I could never have imagined anything like that in my wildest dreams. That's such a fun imagery.
My Google image search unearthed either a giant with 3 heads or a one-headed giant that has like 6 arms and like a whole bunch of legs.
Okay.
Artistic interpretations are abound for Geryon here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the fun side quests in this one is that he hates how hot Spain is so much that he kills the sun or he shoots the sun with a bow and arrow.
Shoots an arrow at the sun, yeah.
And so apparently Geryon falls to Heracles's magic arrows, his poisonous arrows. Apparently he shoots him directly through the forehead with an arrow, which wasn't enough to kill him, but the venom, that's what did it. So so he kills the giant with an arrow.
Yeah.
But then, as he's now having to herd a flock of cattle across the entire Mediterranean back home, Hera, again, women, am I right, sends gadflies to bite the cattle and irritate them, and they scatter. And Heracles then has to spend an entire year finding all of these cows and getting them back together. Then, because she gets mad at that, she then sends a flood so that they can't cross this river. So then he starts piling up rocks and makes the water shallow so that he can cross over. Also, at this point, he decides that the southern coast of Spain is far too annoying. So he makes the stones of Gibraltar and basically creates a path so that sailors can go into the Atlantic from the Mediterranean. And this is why the Strait of Gibraltar sometimes gets called the Pillars of Heracles, the Pillars of Hercules. Yeah,
he opens up the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, basically, is what the idea is.
Gotcha.
And also, just as a fun side quest too, he then randomly has sex with a princess. And one of the things you need to know about Heracles is that every single time he has sex with women, they 100% of the time get pregnant and almost 100% of the time have sons. And this child...
He's like a god in that way, yeah.
And this child just happens to become basically the progenitor of all of the Celtic people, which to the Greeks was basically just anybody who lives sort of France and other.
Right.
Yeah, the whole the whole driving the cattle of Geryon back is an opportunity to sort of have myths that to tie him to a whole bunch of local gods. I mean, we can talk about this later in terms of who Heracles is, but and also to tie in a bunch, because there's shrines to Heracles and like cults of Heracles all over the Western Mediterranean.
Mhm.
And so this myth kind of explains, like, what was he doing there? Well, he was wandering around getting these cows.
Yeah.
So like,
He
there's
spent
like
a long
100
time
different
getting
local
them.
stories.
Mhm.
And how was Heracles? Like, he makes his way into the Aeneid and the foundation of Rome because he happens to be there on his way back from
These
getting
darn
the cattle of
cattle.
Geryon. Like,
yeah.
so it's a way of sort of shoving in all of these stories that don't kind of, why would Heracles be there? He's a Greek, you know, but it's because he was on the way back with those cows.
He was doing his other thing. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, we're getting close. We're at 11 now. We're in the round one. The next one is he then goes shopping for apples. He has to go get some. He has to go to the end of the world and find some golden apples by Hesperides.
Yeah.
But he can't do it because I guess it's too far away or something. So then he decides to go
Aw.
visit the Titan Atlas, who is the person who literally holds up the planet.
Yeah.
And says, "Hey, I'll hold the world for you for a minute. Can you just go get me some apples?" And Atlas is like, "Finally, my burden has been awakened. I no longer have to hold this thing anymore."
Oh.
He goes and gets the apples and he's like, "You know what? I changed my mind, Heracles. You have to stay and lift up the planet forever."
Yeah.
Psych. You got to do it now. And then he's like, "Okay, fine. But can you just hold it for like 1 second while I like adjust my cape so that it's more comfortable?" And he's like, "Okay, fine, sure." And then he takes it and then he's like, "Psych," and then double psych, and then he leaves.
Double psych. Oh,
I'm guessing
boy.
that the Titans sort of have this reputation of being sort of bad guys of Greek myth. So I'm guessing that messing with Atlas is a good thing.
Mhm.
There's a lot less moral weight to most of these stories than we think there is. It's neither good nor bad. It's
They
just
did-
a thing he did.
There is a lot of Greek myth
Later
though,
on,
where
Perseus is going to fly by Atlas holding the head of Medusa, by the way, turning him to stone. And that's why the Atlas Mountains.
Oh,
I'm glad we know
giving
all
you-
these things. I'm learning so much about how things started.
Yeah, exactly.
I learned about weasels earlier. That was fun.
The other thing too is that it seems like there's a lot of stories of like there's a lot of liking of outsmarting powerful people
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
And the last one is that he's like, "All right, you did all these things. I got one that's going to be like really hard. It's impossible. You have to go to the underworld, the death place, and you have to go and steal Hades's dog.
Uh-huh.
The 3-headed dog Cerberus has to be brought back." And he does. And the thing is that the guy who is doing all these things for is like, I actually didn't want the dog. I actually just wanted you to die. Can you send it back?
What am I going to do with the
Yeah, like,
dog?
what am I going to do with Hades' dog?
I don't want my
Yeah.
dog.
Hades,
The
famously,
best thing-
person you don't want to, what's it called? He's a guy who cursed somebody for all time for eating pomegranate seeds. You don't really want to mess with
Yeah,
him.
don't mess with his
The
dog.
best thing about Eurystheus is really early on, he gets scared by Heracles bringing things back, scary things, like depending on the order of the things, even the Nemean lion's corpse like scares him. So in some versions, he gets a big bronze jar built into the earth that he can hide in whenever Heracles is on his way back, so that he's protected from whatever Heracles brings back, because he keeps bringing back these, like, he sends him to get scary things, but then he comes back with these scary things. And this is not what he wants. So there are pictures on vases of Eurystheus peeking out of this like subterranean vase while Heracles is bringing Cerberus or other things back.
Oh,
with him.
that's
Like
so
Oscar the
funny.
Grouch or something.
There is so much humor in Heracles' stories. Like, it's really important to remember that too, that there's a lot of just plain jokes that go on in his myths too.
Oh,
Yeah.
Love it.
that's so fun.
So that's like his main 12 labors. He does have an unofficial 13th labor, which is that he's then challenged to have sex with 50 women in a single night, and he gets every single one of them pregnant.
Of course he does.
Except one who becomes his virgin priestess. But yes.
There you go. Yeah. But then basically several people, including the kings of Sparta and several people throughout history, have claimed their ancestry to Heracles through this particular labor.
Set of, yeah.
Yeah.
Because again, every single one get pregnant. Almost every single one has sons. That's the trick. And even some Roman emperors claim that this was their ancestry. And of course, because Heracles was a Greek symbol of masculinity, he also had a lot of sex with the boys. Plutarch, in his book called Erotikos, says that Heracles' male lovers were, quote, beyond counting.
Nice.
After his thing, he engages in various battles and adventures. He marries three more times. I think he goes into 4 wives. He rescues Prometheus. He sacks Troy. He founds a colony in Sardinia for some reason, and he goes in a war campaign. And eventually, he marries again women. Am I right? He marries a woman by the name of Deianira.
Deianira, yeah.
Yeah. So after fighting a river creature that Heracles kills,
cool.
In his dying words, with the poison arrow, might I add. So he kills this monster, the river lord, with the arrow. Deianira, the monster says to Deianira, hey, if you take some of my blood and you put it on Heracles, he's gonna love you forever, because the river lord knows that his blood is full of the hydra venom. So then he goes off.
Just keeps coming back up.
Yeah. This was the one you were to remember that for.
Gotcha.
So then he goes off and has another paramour that I didn't write down, but basically Iole. Yeah.
Another princess that he rescues from someone, and Deianira thinks he's going to fall in love with her instead.
So she's like, okay, I gotta fix this. So she sends him a tunic that has the blood of the River Lord in it, but it's been washed off, so you can't see the blood, but the venom's still there. He puts it on, and the venom is so potent that even it being on the clothing, touching him, starts to kill him. And this is where there's two different stories. It starts to burn him. He's either in such agonizing amounts of pain that he wants to die, or he is dying, depending upon how you tell the story. He's in such a great amount of pain that he gets one of his friends to essentially set him on fire. And as that happens, the human part of him gets burned away, and leaving him as a god who then ends up marrying the goddess of youth named Hebe. Hebe?
Hebe, whatever.
He gets the heebie-jeebies up on Mount Olympus. So that's
the goddess of youth and immortality. Yeah.
So that is the Greek myth of Heracles, told on It's Probably Not Aliens, the podcast about UFOs and stuff.
Aliens.
So that's the Greek thing. The thing is that this legend has shown up all over the world. As you mentioned, there's cults of him all over the Western Mediterranean, but there's evidence of people observing, because Greek mythology also moved into the Middle East. Big part, this is why all the Islamic scholars and all of all of Sharia law was all developed with Greek philosophy at its core. But basically, you see representations of Heracles in Zoroastrian stuff in modern day Iran, and there's even one really cool statue that shows Heracles protecting the Buddha in India, I believe, which just shows how far the story really got.
Don't forget, Alexander the Great gets to India, and one of the things about him is that one of his heroes is Hercules, because Heracles is the great conqueror. So, the cult of Heracles moves with Alexander the Great into India and then beyond. So, he spreads, gets around.
And in these polytheistic societies, very often gods from other religions can just be sort of added. Yeah. It's like how the Greeks near the end started observing the cult of Bastet, the Egyptian cat goddess. So that all happens. But then the big cheese sort of picks up. We don't talk about Greco-Roman without talking about Romans. And so the Romans gave him a rebrand, no longer being called the Honored of Hera, which basically is what Heracles translates to, which is an extremely ironic name, but then becomes Hercules, the name that we typically refer him to now as.
Yeah, it's basically, there were lots of Greeks in southern Italy, known as Magna Graecia, Big Greece, and that had been there from the 6th century on, and they spoke a dialect of Greek that was sort of a little different, like all the dialects of Greek were a little different, and in their dialect, they called him the same name, Heracles, was pronounced Hercules, and so that's how it made its way into Latin, and that's true of a bunch, that's why we get Odysseus becomes Ulysses, and again, that's sort of through, it's through these weirdo Southern Italian Greeks who have this different dialect, so we get a bunch of names. So it's the same name, but it just doesn't sound the same.
Southern Italians on blast.
Weirdos.
Come at me.
Take that, Southern Italians. No, I remember Southern Italians are kind of screwed over when it comes to Italian wealth redistribution.
I don't want to walk into that particular battle.
True. But yeah, Hercules is the Roman equivalent of Heracles, but the Romans adapted the stories and images into their own literature and art and turned him into a major figure of Western culture. He became associated with other figures, and a lot of Roman emperors started using his image in their propaganda. In Roman mythology, he had a lot of similar stories. Hercules had a lot of personal challenges. There's some details that get changed, like instead of Hera sending the snakes, it's some witches. Hera sends some witches that then, Juno is her name in
Juno. Yeah, Juno is the equivalent. Yeah.
Juno sends some witches to then send some snakes. She has like a middle.
The Romans really liked their witches.
Yeah.
Witches were big in Rome. I mean, I say they didn't like
they
them.
Didn't like them, but they liked using them. They liked what they accomplished in a good story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He starts to become associated with various myths. One of the big ones is that he fights a monster called Cacus.
Yeah, and Cacus, that was the one I mentioned about the Aeneid, that it makes that story makes its way into the Aeneid, story of the foundation of Rome. Yeah.
And also
Cacus also just means bad guy. Like literally, it's the Latin.
Kills bad guy.
It's the Greek for bad. So
that's
Cactus
awesome.
is just bad.
Okay.
So you want some allegory? I've got you some allegory there.
There you go. He also becomes associated with the Aventine Hill in Rome. So he becomes like a big part of, Rome being an empire that was like single-mindedly focused on conquering and subjugating people. You could imagine Hercules plays a pretty big role in their self-concept. He gets incorporated into a lot of their stuff, worshipped as a deity, considered a patron of children in childbirth. Roman brides would often wear a special belt tied with the quote knot of Hercules, which was sort of the idea about childhood and fighting off the snakes and everything. He receives a cult as early as the 6th century BC with a temple located near the shrine of Carmenta.
Yeah, which is just the Carmenta, an early nymph in the history of Roman religion.
And as you mentioned, a lot of the Romans, they build a lot of his myth in Rome by talking about stuff he did while he was doing his 10th labor, trying to get the cattle of Geryon. And one of the biggest ones is one of the biggest observations of him is something called the Ara Maxima, which is this temple dedicated to Hercules in the Forum Boreum.
The cattle market. Yep.
The cattle market, which is associated with obviously Geryon and the cattle.
Yeah.
Oftentimes he was associated with communal meals. They would do, this is the most like Chad alpha male, like freaking Joe Rogan type thing ever. So the way that they would do a festival of Hercules is you would have a feast where no women allowed, not one. Any women banned.
Can't have them.
Can't have them. Then they would go and kill a cow. And the basic rule was this festival can't end until every part of this cow has been consumed. And they have to just sit and eat cow the entire night, assumingly not pooping for several days afterwards. And they would do it at places like the Ara Maxima. So women were banned from this because Hercules is for the lads, I guess. And even though there are a lot of and I couldn't find a lot of great stuff on this, but there was a lot of women who had their own sort of private observations of Hercules, and I guess having a lot to do with the childbirth stuff, but also, I don't know, superheroes.
Yeah, we know there were a lot of private female cults, and remember, cult, that does not mean what you think it means when I say it, just to remind you, just female religious rituals, but they are not preserved very well in our records due to our records being written by people who were not female.
Yeah.
Like all of them. So and who could not care. First of all, probably didn't know because they weren't supposed to be there. So they didn't know much about the women's religion, but also could not have cared less.
Yeah.
But yeah, the thing is, because it was Rome and Rome ended up becoming the political and mythological basis for basically all of Western Europe, Hercules' stories have been reinterpreted and remixed over and over again throughout. And as, of course, Christianity became heavily syncretized with Roman religion, a lot of Jesus's, I don't want to get too contradictory of canon of some people's very important beliefs, but there's a lot of details that get added to Jesus's life as it sort of mixes with Roman faith. And part of it is taking aspects of heroes like Hercules and sort of applying them to his own story. But it means that Hercules Hercules' story was very prevalent in all of Western Europe. There's lots of medieval and Renaissance paintings of him. Lots of nude statues of him made in the Renaissance age, because he was, again, he was really the alpha male. Like
He
that is
was
like the idea. He is the reference. He is the ideal idea of masculinity to these societies. That's sort of one of the things he really represents. Power,
especially
conquest.
to the Roman world. I will say especially to the Roman world, because there's an argument to be made that he was not physically the representation of the ideal for the Greek world, who tended towards a more moderate, in-between kind of, like Hercules has all the big muscles. And if you look at most Greek statuary, it's not the big muscles. It's like an athlete, but not the huge. And so sometimes Hercules is depicted in Greek art as being kind of excessive and too much and like over the top. But the Romans were all over the too much and over the top. So for them, like that really, really is true for the Rome. But there's an interesting distinction between Heracles as kind of the savage in a way in the Greek world, like impressive, but not to be emulated. But when he moves into the Roman world, the Romans' Hercules is much more to be emulated. You mentioned the emperors who, have statues of themselves in wearing Heracles's lion skin and stuff like that. Like that it was someone to model yourself on for the Romans in a way that maybe wasn't quite so true for the Greeks.
Fair.
Interesting.
It's a sort of interesting difference.
Yeah, there's some research to try and figure out what the origin of the story is. Some believe that he is sort of a depiction of sort of more ancient than ancient Greek, but like sort of Neolithic Greek hunter-gatherer culture, and maybe some references like the sort of pelts and stuff like that to sort of shamanistic practices that existed in the area. It also could be that his story is semi-based on a real person or several people who've had their feats of strength exaggerated beyond reasoning, but there might have been an origin in a real person at a certain point who was just a huge dude, I guess.
Just like, gang, there was so much poop, I had to do 2 rivers to flush it out. You wouldn't even believe.
Well, yeah, there's a bunch of his stories that really do feel like they started off as, so a friend of a friend said.
Yeah.
And they barely rise to the level of myth. They're really just like, I heard.
Yeah. But yeah, Hercules stands as like the epitome of two. I know we're kind of running over time, so I want to make sure that I get this too. But like the picture about him is that he represents 2 huge things that are really influential in Western canon. One, the demigod, this person who acts as a sort of conduit between the realm of the god or the gods and humanity, this sort of bridge, which as anyone who's grown up in a Christian society knows that that's a huge part of the identity of that religion. But also demigods play a role in various different faiths in different places around the world. You have like lots of these show up. But second, he's also a hero, and heroes like these individuals who do great deeds, who do amazing or powerful things, and then die in some sort of a magnificent fashion, is a huge part of the way Western culture. Case in point, the last decade of movies, where basically, unless it's based on some guy who is basically an idealized male form drawn in a comic book, you're not going to get your movie passed. So this is, and I'm not like original in saying this, that like superheroes in our world today are sort of the representative of, or the modern day iteration of these sorts of things. And even to the extent that like Superman's origin stories are very obviously influenced by the story of Hercules. Yeah. There's even a comic book, like I'm trying to remember, the Grant Morrison All-Star Superman is basically Superman doing his own 12 labors before he dies of too much sunshine.
And let's not forget that one of the most popular Marvel superheroes right now is Thor, who is a god in these myths. So
and he's met Hercules, in fact, recently. Just
also true.
Right.
Yeah, Hercules is in the MCU. So
is he?
Yeah. Yeah, he has a brief cameo right at the end of the last movie, last Thor movie. But he's in the comics, right?
Yes.
Like there were
also
a whole series of Hercules comics,
for sure.
I'm just gonna.
Sorry, go ahead.
My headcanon is that he's what's his name? I want to say Macho Man Randy Savage, but that's not that. But there's a guy whose name is Savage in the DC comics who's like a caveman who's been alive
Vandal
forever.
Savage.
Yeah. Anyways, continue.
So can I just riff a little bit on that superhero thing? Because
please,
I think to bring it back, God forbid I do this, but to bring it back to the Ancient Aliens tie-in,
Someone had to.
Things, one of the things that they kind of, I think, having not actually watched the episode, because that is not something I'm willing to do, even for you, Tristan. I'm not watching this show. But one of the reasons they can say these things like, oh, maybe it's a real person or whatever, is because sometimes myths work that way, right? Sometimes some legends, some myths are kind of over-exaggerated versions of some actual event. And people have argued that the Troy story is things like that. But there's lots of ways that myths happen. And Heracles is really one of the really good examples of the way that myths, once they get to a certain size, they kind of eat the rest of the myths. They get them all. And this is like the MCU, is that like they just bring in all the things that have been referenced and then make it part of the same canon. So Heracles probably started so one of the things about heroes in the Greek sense is that they are local. So every region has its own little local, because, it's the guy who founded your city or happened to do a thing or has his tomb here or whatever. So they're all local, whereas gods are kind of, maybe not everywhere, but they kind of go over much more than one city. Heroes are local. Heracles almost certainly started as a local hero, but for whatever reason, his stories were particularly good. Maybe somebody told them really well. Maybe for whatever reason, they kind of took on a bit of a life of their own. And then he started to eat up the stories of everybody else. So what we can sort of trace a little bit, especially when you look at the geographical, like his labors, most of them, the first 6 of them, happen really within the Peloponnese, which is, part of Greece, and most of them in the Argolid, which is around the city of Argos. And then they kind of expand out. And then by the end, like you talked about, Geryon and the Hesperides and Cerberus, they're the underworld and they're the farthest reaches of the world. So we can sort of see even in that progression, from the local to he's pulling up all these other, and we see syncretism, like you talked about. We see him, that's a Carthaginian god that gets the Greek and the Romans are like, oh, that's clearly their name for Hercules. And we see, and then all the stuff about, and I'm not going to get started on the hero's journey stuff because I have so much to say about that we would derail this entirely. But let's just say that there are similarities between heroic stories across cultures. That is a true thing, even though the hero's journey stuff is kind of way overblown. But so it's very easy to match your hero to other heroes because they're going to have a lot. Oh, he has a weird birth too. He's from a god too. Oh, okay. That, same thing, same deal. But where I'm going to pull it back to the comics is that what you get is a whole bunch of contradictory stories that don't actually gel. Like some of the Greek sources try to put them all in order. And you did, you tried that with what you were doing, Tristan. You tried to kind of make like a coherent narrative. Well, in some of the versions, he comes back from the 12 labors and kills his wife and children then. So like, how on earth could they be a punishment for killing his wife and children if he does it afterwards? Like there are complete and total contradictions in his story. And one of the ways I used to always tell students was to think of it like, how many ways did Batman start? Like, how many origin stories for Batman do you know? And can you read the comics and all the different comics and watch the movies and all the different movies? And can you hold all those in your head? Can you still be entertained? Or do you have to be like, well, that movie can't be correct because the other movie is correct? There's only one origin story for Batman. There's only one way that, no. I think people who do the comics and the superheroes and, are very comfortable with there's just a bunch of different storylines and there's a bunch of different versions and they all kind of can exist in my head at the same time. And that's how the Greeks thought about myth in general and the gods. Like nobody was sitting there trying to make it all make sense.
That is,
goodness knows it doesn't.
Yes, that is like I've always been that way with comic books specifically too, because like whenever they have these like big events that try to like unify the continuity to be like, all right, there's a lot of inconsistencies. We're gonna like mush all these worlds together and make it make sense. And here's the official way it happened. I'm like, I don't care though. Like, I just want you to tell a good story. I don't care if there are contradictions. And if that means
you got to throw some of this stuff out the window and like, you get that with all the Greek, like the Greek tragedians, they have Greek tragedies about the same story. Like the same author will tell multiple versions of the same. Sophocles has 3 plays about Oedipus that survive, and they are self-contradictory. Like they're often done as the 3, as if it's a trilogy. They don't make sense. You cannot make the timelines, and some characters die in one version and don't in the other. Like, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And the Greeks couldn't care less. That's fine. So I think it opens it up to these ancient, like people the ancient aliens wants to give you an explanation. They want to sort of like trace it back. Like and the idea that you could use bits of the stories to make, to find the truth is such a fundamental misunderstanding of what a myth is and how myth works that you said you're not going to lower yourself to debunking the question of like, was Heracles real? And you're right, because the question, was Heracles real, is irrelevant to how myth works. It just doesn't make any sense. And if you can handle the sort of fiction, and because like comics and stuff and superheroes are more than just fiction. They're this shared world that everybody can kind of like add their own bits into and develop. And no one person, there's an originator for each of those stories, but no one person ever like owns all of Batman or Superman or like
in their entirety.
So we won't go too far into that. So I was just gonna say, but they can't you can't do a master narrative because there is no one person who has that whole story. And if you use that and think about myth that way, then it stops you from trying to find the real Hercules or the real story because there can't be, there never was, and there never will be.
Be like trying to find the real Batman.
That's my myth rant.
No, thank you.
That's a very good way to put a button on this episode. And I'm going to ask two things, and maybe Scott will cut them because I feel like that was a way better strong ending than what I could ask. But one is now I want the Batman story where his parents die after he becomes Batman. And they get to figure out how that's a thing. And then the second is then if like continuity and myth did not matter that much, does that mean that like even in these ancient times, like your average Athenian wouldn't be entirely convinced that like if you're there asked like, is Heracles was he a real person? They'd be like, meh, it's a story. Like if they would understood it was fiction at the time.
Yeah, I mean that's a really complicated question as to what extent did say your average Athenian think that the myths were real, and I think they wouldn't have had a global answer to that. Like they would have definitely thought some of them was real. They would have thought Heracles was a real thing. Most people. Some people didn't at all, but most people would have. But they'd be perfectly comfortable with the idea that some of the stories might be real and some of them might not, and some of them might be exaggerated. But also, we also have to think of ourselves in a world where you don't have the same kind of like really clear understanding of historical events in a really, just think about, we know that things happened in a certain order because we're used to reading them in books and putting them on a timeline. And the Athenians kept their own records, but they, didn't have that real sense of like how long ago was this, that, or the other. Yeah. And so I don't think that most people bothered their head too much about which parts of it were real. And it also wouldn't upset them if some stuff wasn't real. That wouldn't mean that Heracles wasn't real, or that it, to disprove some aspects, say, or to question some aspects of the myths wouldn't be like a problem because you don't need them all to be true for the overall thing to be true. Does that make sense?
Yeah. All right, I got it. So thank you so much, Aven, for you definitely, I feel like this episode would have not even been a shadow of what it ended up being without your insight, because and I'm just glad that I got to get you in a situation where you got to talk about Greco-Roman mythology for an hour. So
it was a pleasure. It's been too long since I've had the opportunity, so I'm very pleased to have the chance to come on and just go nerdy on this stuff because they're such good stories. Like any excuse.
So what are the things? Fun. If people wanted to find more of you and your stuff, where should they go?
Well, so I am on a podcast because everybody has a podcast, and my podcast is called The Endless Knot, and we talk about etymology and history. But we also have an episode about all the different film versions of Hercules. For instance, we watched a whole bunch of Hercules film versions. So we cover anything we feel like. But that's The Endless Knot, and I'm also help run a YouTube channel that my husband mostly does called Alliterative, or The Endless Knot. We're bad at branding, sorry. And it's about etymology in particular. And so that's youtube.com/alliterative, or you can go to alliterative.net to find all of our stuff. And I'm also on Twitter at Aven Sarah, AvenSarah, if you're interested.
Yeah. We'll have links to everything in the description. Does Tristan's dad listen to your podcast?
I mean, I'm going to assume yes until I get evidence to the contrary.
There you go.
I do like that.
My father doesn't listen to my podcast, so he would. It's just, the CBC is on all the time. He just doesn't really get around to it.
Yeah. Just say that Mark now does randomly show up on my TikTok sometimes. I'm just like,
oh yes,
in between dance videos, just like. What a
telling
dirty
you about
word.
surprisingly connected etymologies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, but yeah, check out that stuff. It's all really good. And
Thanks.
obviously, like look at the wonderful juice we got for this episode. So, if you
So
want more of
good.
that.
If you want to hear me ranting about other elements of the ancient world, please do.
Yeah.
Take a check out the podcast.
She was also I did an episode about the fasces like a number of years ago, and she helped me out a lot with that episode as well. A step back episode, like this is like in like 2018 or something.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Been the few 4 times.
Well, if you want to follow more of our show, you can follow us at Probs Not Aliens on Twitter and Instagram. And Tristan, you just teased a little thing. You have what's Step Back? What's that?
Step Back's a YouTube channel that I make where I do videos about why understanding the past is important for making everything that's going on today make sense. And if you're listening to this now, I have a video that is, if I'm not canceled by this point, which I very well may be, because my next video is about China and specifically trying to tell the story of some of China's fiddlier bits without trying to frame a Cold War narrative about it for either side, which is going to get me mad with someone. Yeah. But Scott, if I wanted to know about plagiarism and why
I
plagiarism,
should hopefully have a different video out by then.
if I want to know about a different video than that, where would I want to go?
Hi, I have a YouTube channel called Nerdsync. My next video that I'm working on, I've already filmed. It should be up by this time. Is about how because we're currently in the middle of a writer's strike, and the previous writer's strike led to the horrible movie X-Men Origins Wolverine, and so I wanted to talk about it to remind people that hey, maybe writers are important, and maybe we should treat them well and pay them well. Because I don't want any more X-Men Origins Wolverine, please. No, thank you.
Yeah, because the world of myth is large and can encompass many things like superheroes, but some bits just don't belong.
Some of it we're just gonna toss aside. No thanks. Yeah. And that's my YouTube channel, Nerdsync. Nerdsync. You can also listen to this podcast an episode early sometimes when I remember to do it over on Nebula, nebula.tv/probably-not-aliens. And thank you to everyone who writes reviews of this show on Apple Podcasts. And you can give us feedback on Spotify. I got to figure out a way to incorporate that into this show. That would be fun. But otherwise, just thanks for telling your friends and spreading the word about the show and trying, sometimes it works. Sometimes your friend is Tristan's dad and he just doesn't care. He doesn't care about his own son's achievements.
God, my dad's really on blast to this one.
We'll crack them someday. The best place to send your friends is probsnotaliens.com. It's a website with all the stuff, all the links to where you can listen to this show. And I think that's everything, yeah?
I think so, yeah.
Well, thank you so much again for joining. And until next time, my name is Scott Nicewander.
I'm Tristan Johnson, and the truth is out there. Pithanos. I probably butchered that, but whatever.
No, sounded good to me.
Couldn't find an ancient Greek version. Ancient Greek isn't on Google Translate.